The envelope arrived without warning on a gray November morning, slipped under my office door at the university with no indication of sender or origin. I almost discarded it. My department receives dozens of unsolicited materials each month, most of them tangential to my research or fundamentally unreliable as historical sources. But something in the weight of this envelope, the careful way it had been sealed, prompted me to open it rather than file it away. Inside was a single photograph, aged to the point of fragility, and a handwritten note on paper so thin it seemed barely capable of holding ink without deteriorating entirely. The note read simply, "My grandfather kept this for 70 years. He made us promise never to show anyone, but he's gone now, and I think history needs to see this. I think the world needs to understand what he chose to do." The photograph itself appeared at first glance to be entirely innocent, the kind of image that emerged countless times during the Pacific Campaign and its immediate aftermath. It showed an American soldier, young, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, standing in what appeared to be the ruins of a Japanese civilian settlement. The soldier wore the uniform of the U.S. Army, his rifle slung casually across his shoulder, his posture relaxed. Beside him stood what appeared to be a Japanese family, a woman, a man, and 2 children. They were positioned at a careful distance from the soldier, the way people position themselves when a photograph is being taken by a stranger, when the photograph is not an intimate family moment but a documentary record. The setting was devastation. Behind them stretched the wreckage of what had once been a neighborhood. Collapsed wooden structures, debris scattered across the ground, the blackened remains of buildings reduced to ash and charcoal. This was post-atomic landscape, or simply the aftermath of conventional bombing. Either way, it was evidence of systemic destruction carried out from the air. The photograph bore no date, no location marking, no caption, only the handwritten note on the back in faded pencil. August 1945, somewhere in Osaka. We refused, but the note in the envelope had referenced something specific. Until you see the boy's hand. And so I examined the photograph more carefully, studying the children in the image. There was a girl of perhaps 6 years old and a boy of perhaps 10. The boy was positioned closest to the American soldier, and his right hand was clearly visible in the photograph, extended not toward the soldier, but toward the woman beside him. The woman, presumably the boy's mother, was holding his hand. And in that hand-holding, in that simple gesture of a child gripping a parent's hand, I could see something that transformed the entire meaning of the photograph. The boy's expression was not fearful, not hostile, not the expression one might expect from a Japanese child in the presence of an American occupation soldier. His face bore an expression of peace, of safety, of the kind of trust a child only extends when they understand that the adult beside them has made the choice to protect them. I turned the photograph over again and studied the notation more carefully. We refused. Refused what? The context was unclear, but the implication was profound. An American soldier had apparently refused something in the immediate aftermath of the war's end in the Pacific. He had refused in a way that was significant enough that his family had been instructed to preserve the photograph for 70 years, waiting for the moment when it could safely be revealed. My hands were trembling as I set the photograph on my desk lamp, examining it under magnification. The soldier's face was clearly visible, young, serious, his eyes reflecting something that suggested moral deliberation. The Japanese family's positioning suggested they were comfortable with him, or at minimum that they trusted him sufficiently to stand near him while a photograph was being taken. In August 1945, in occupied Japan, this comfort would have been remarkable. It would have suggested not merely a momentary interaction, but some kind of relationship, some kind of understanding that transcended the fundamental categories of enemy and victor that were supposed to define the occupation. I immediately began researching the provenance of the photograph, the handwriting in the notes, any identifying marks that might help me trace its origin. The postmark on the envelope was recent, mailed within the past week from somewhere in Oregon. The handwriting suggested someone in their 50s or 60s, someone educated enough to write clearly but not formally trained in calligraphy. The paper of the envelope itself was expensive, the kind a person might use for correspondence of significance. I knew with absolute certainty that this photograph documented something that official history had apparently decided to leave unrecorded. I knew that I was being asked to participate in the revelation of a secret that had been carefully guarded for 7 decades. And I understood that uncovering the story behind it would require me to venture into the complicated aftermath of the war in the Pacific, a period that American historical consciousness has often treated with less moral complexity than the European theater, as if the war against Japan could be understood purely in terms of military necessity, rather than as a collision between human beings, some of whom chose compassion despite everything that systems demanded. I reached for my phone to contact colleagues at nearby universities who specialized in the Pacific War and Japanese occupation history, and I understood that I was about to embark on a journey of historical reconstruction that would demand far more than scholarly analysis. It would demand empathy. It would demand the willingness to see beyond uniform and nationality to the fundamental human capacity for kindness in moments when kindness seemed impossible. The boy in the photograph was holding his mother's hand. An American soldier stood beside them, clearly, unambiguously choosing to do something other than what occupation protocols apparently demanded. And somewhere, for 70 years, a family had carried this photograph as testimony to that choice. Now finally, they had chosen to let it be seen. Now finally, the world would have the opportunity to understand what we refused had meant on an August morning in 1945. Over the following 3 weeks, I examined the photograph obsessively, employing every technique available to modern archival analysis. I obtained high-resolution scans. I consulted with photographic experts about the film stock, the camera used, the printing process. I cross-referenced the architectural details visible in the background against maps of Japanese cities devastated by bombing in the final weeks of the war. I studied the uniforms worn by the American soldier with military historians. Every detail I examined only deepened the mystery and intensified my conviction that this photograph documented something historically significant. The soldier's uniform bore insignia identifying him as belonging to the 20th Infantry Regiment, 6th Army Corps, units that had been involved in the occupation of Japan following the atomic bombings. His rifle was an M1 Garand, standard issue. His boots showed signs of significant wear, suggesting he had been in theater for months. But what arrested my attention most powerfully was not the military details, but the soldier's facial expression and his body language. His face, while serious, bore no trace of the contempt or dehumanization visible in other photographs from the occupation period. There was no swagger, no sense of victorious triumph. Instead, his expression suggested something closer to tenderness, a careful attention to the people beside him, a deliberate choice to maintain distance while simultaneously offering presence. His right hand hung at his side, but not in the rigid military posture typical of official documentation. His hand appeared relaxed, almost as if he had recently released it from some form of contact. The Japanese family's positioning was equally extraordinary. In countless photographs from the occupation period, Japanese civilians were positioned at distance from American soldiers, their expressions often reflecting fear or resignation or barely concealed hostility. But in this photograph, the family stood closer to the soldier than occupation protocol typically permitted. The woman, presumably the mother, stood between the soldier and the children, but her posture was not protective in the sense of shielding her children from the American. Rather, her positioning suggested something more nuanced, acknowledgement of the soldier while maintaining appropriate boundaries. But it was the boy's hand that continued to haunt me. His grip on his mother's hand was not the defensive grip of a child frightened by a foreigner. It was the secure grip of a child who understood that his mother had made a choice to be safe in this moment. The boy's other hand hung at his side, and his fingers appeared to be curled around something small, a piece of candy perhaps, or a small gift. In the photograph's grain, I could not determine precisely what, but the protectiveness of his grip suggested something of value to him, something he had been given and was protecting carefully. The girl, younger, stood slightly behind the mother, her hand resting on her mother's hip. Her expression was curious rather than fearful, as if she was studying the American soldier with the unguarded interest of a child encountering something unfamiliar, but not necessarily threatening. This expression, the absence of fear in children who had experienced the systematic bombing of their country, suggested something remarkable about the relationship between the soldier and this family. It suggested trust that transcended the categories of enemy and conqueror. I consulted with Dr. Kenji Yamamoto at UC Berkeley, a specialist in Japanese-American relations during the occupation period. When I showed him high-resolution scans of the photograph, his response was immediate and emotional. "This is remarkable," he had said, his voice tight. "This is not a typical occupation photograph. Look at the composition. Look at the positioning. Someone deliberately took this photograph to document something. Someone wanted to preserve evidence that an American soldier had chosen to show kindness to a Japanese family, rather than participate in whatever violence or exploitation was being normalized during this period." I then reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen at Columbia University, who specializes in the immediate post-war period and the experiences of occupation soldiers. She confirmed Yamamoto's assessment, but added a crucial piece of context. In August 1945, immediately after the atomic bombings and the Japanese surrender, there was significant disorder in occupied territories. American soldiers, many of them traumatized by the war, operating in a context where Japanese civilians were viewed with deep suspicion and often outright hostility. Occupation protocol was harsh, fraternization with civilians was discouraged, and interactions with women and children especially were often exploitative. A photograph showing an American soldier choosing kindness, choosing not to exploit or harm, this would have been extraordinary. This would have been something that needed to be hidden. Armed with this context, I began researching historical records of the 20th Infantry Regiment's occupation duties in August 1945, unit rosters, casualty reports, court-martial records, officer statements. Slowly, methodically, I began constructing a framework of possibility, cross-referencing the uniform details and insignia visible in the photograph with known service records. The handwriting in the note accompanying the photograph suggested someone whose family had kept the image as a kind of sacred object for 70 years. This suggested a family member, a son or grandson of the soldier, who had inherited both the photograph and the obligation to protect it. I began searching for descendants of soldiers who had served with the 20th Infantry in August 1945, focusing on Oregon, since the envelope had been postmarked from that state, and surrounding regions. The breakthrough came through a genealogy website when I discovered a family named Richardson, with multiple entries for soldiers who had served in the Pacific Theater during the war's final months. One name appeared prominently: Sergeant David Richardson, who had served with the 20th Infantry Regiment from June 1945 until the occupation period, and had returned home to Portland, Oregon, in late 1946. David Richardson had apparently maintained a quiet life after the war, worked as a school teacher, married, raised children, lived until 1998. He had maintained the photograph and the note for 53 years, apparently instructing his family to preserve them but never revealing their full significance. His son, Michael Richardson, now 71 years old, was still living in Portland. When I called the number I had located, Michael answered on the second ring. When I explained my research and described the photograph, there was a long silence. Then he had said simply, "I've been waiting for someone like you to call." My father kept that photograph for his entire life. He made us promise we would give it to a historian when the time was right. He said the story needed to be told, but only after he was gone. Only when it could be told without endangering anyone. I think that time has come. Michael Richardson agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop in Portland 2 weeks later. He brought with him not only the original photograph, but also a leather journal that his father had maintained throughout the war and the occupation period. The journal was remarkably detailed, filled with entries dated and time-stamped, written in careful handwriting that suggested a man processing his experiences through the act of documentation. The first entries from the Pacific Campaign were standard military documentation, logistics, supply manifests, the mundane reality of military service during wartime. But as the war progressed and David moved from support roles into more direct involvement with combat operations, the journal entries became increasingly reflective, increasingly troubled by the moral dimensions of the war. One entry from July 1945, just weeks before the end of the war in the Pacific, read, "Today I was ordered to participate in the interrogation of Japanese prisoners. The word interrogation is generous. What we are doing is torture. I refuse to participate. The officer in charge said I was a coward. I told him I was a human being trying to remain human. He said they are the enemy and don't deserve humanity. I am beginning to understand that this war is not about military necessity. It is about something darker. The systematic dehumanization of an entire people so that we don't have to confront what we are doing to them. Another entry, dated August 1st, 1945. The war will be over soon. Everyone can feel it. The atomic bombs have changed everything. Japan will surrender. And then what? What happens when the war is over but we are still here, occupying a devastated country, surrounded by civilians who have lost everything? I think about how we will treat them. I think about what choices we will make when there is no longer even the pretense of military necessity to justify our actions. And then, entries describing the specific events that led to the photograph. August 15th, 1945. Orders have come to begin occupation duties. We are being assigned to a neighborhood in Osaka that was heavily bombed. Our job is to establish order, search for hidden weapons, identify any remaining military personnel who might resist. The neighborhood is devastated. Buildings are ruins. And among the ruins are families trying to find food, trying to find shelter, trying to survive. I was assigned to search a partially collapsed structure. I found a woman and 2 children hiding in the basement. They were terrified. I could have followed protocol. I could have detained them, brought them in for questioning, treated them as potential security threats. But when I saw the children's faces, I understood something essential. These are not soldiers. These are not enemies. These are people who have lost their homes, who are hungry, who are afraid. And I am supposed to treat them as threats? The next entry was dated August 16th. I made a decision yesterday that I understand now will haunt me forever. I decided to help the family I found. I brought them food from my rations. I helped them secure the basement where they were hiding. I positioned them somewhere safer. And I kept it secret. I told no one. When my commanding officer asked what I had found in the structure, I said it was empty. I lied. I chose to lie rather than participate in the systematic occupation violence we have been ordered to enact. A photographer, I never learned his name, was documenting our work. I asked him if he would take a photograph of me with the family. I asked him to preserve it. I wanted evidence that at least one American soldier had chosen compassion. He agreed. He said he understood what I was doing. He said the photograph needed to exist. Michael had brought copies of several subsequent journal entries that documented David's continued efforts to provide assistance to the family he had encountered. He had apparently continued bringing them food over several weeks. He had helped them find more secure shelter. He had, in small ways, attempted to ameliorate the violence of the occupation through individual acts of kindness that violated every protocol he had been given. August 20th, 1945. The mother of the family asked me my name. I told her. She told me hers. Yuki. The boy is named Hiroshi. The girl is Akiko. They should not have names to me. According to occupation protocol, they should be numbers, categories, potential security threats. But they have names. They have stories. Yuki's husband is dead, killed in the bombing of Osaka. She is trying to raise her children alone. The boy, Hiroshi, saved a piece of candy from before the war. He shows it to me each time I visit, as if to remind both of us that there was a time before all of this, a time when childhood included candy and safety. I gave him a piece of American chocolate yesterday. I watched him eat it slowly, savoring it as if it was the most precious thing he had ever tasted. In that moment, I understood that the categories we use to separate ourselves, American and Japanese, victor and vanquished, soldier and civilian, are temporary constructs that mean nothing in the face of shared humanity. Michael explained that his father had eventually been transferred to different occupation duties and had lost contact with the family. The photograph had been the only tangible evidence that his relationship with them had been real, that his choice to help them had been documented. In the decades following the war, David had apparently attempted several times to locate Yuki and the children, but the post-war chaos in Japan made it nearly impossible. He had died in 1998 without knowing whether they had survived, whether his small acts of kindness had made any meaningful difference. But the journal entries continued to the end of his life, with periodic entries reflecting on the photograph and what it represented. One final entry, dated 1997, less than a year before David's death, read, "I am 74 years old. I have lived 52 years since that August day in 1945. I have lived a good life. I became a teacher, married a woman I loved, raised children who are good people. But I have never stopped thinking about that family. I have never stopped wondering if they survived. I have never stopped feeling the weight of what I refused to participate in during the occupation. That photograph is the only proof that my refusal mattered, that I chose humanity over protocol. When I'm gone, I want someone to know this. I want someone to understand that even in the face of systematic violence, individual choices matter. Even in the darkest moments, compassion is possible. That photograph is my testimony. Michael had inherited the photograph and the journals with the explicit instruction to share them with a historian when the time seemed right. When I asked him why he had chosen to contact me, he explained that he had seen my recent publication on moral agency during the Pacific War and understood that I would approach the material with the necessary complexity and respect. My father lived his entire life carrying this secret, Michael had said. He made us promise to protect it, but he also made us understand that eventually it needed to be shared. He believed the world needed to know that Americans were capable of kindness during the occupation, that we were not monolithic, that even in circumstances where dehumanization was the norm, individual soldiers could choose differently. I think he would want that message to reach people. I asked the question that had been haunting me since I first saw the photograph. Did your father ever learn what happened to the family? Michael pulled out another document, a letter dated 1987, written on Japanese stationery. It was addressed to David Richardson at his home in Portland. The envelope had been forwarded multiple times before reaching him, suggesting a long journey through the post-war chaos of Japan and the subsequent decades of separation. We found this, Michael said quietly, among my father's papers after he died. He had apparently commissioned a historian in Japan to search for the family in the 1970s. Yuki apparently survived the war and the occupation. She lived until 1985. But before she died, she had apparently asked someone to help her locate the American soldier who had helped her and her children. She wrote this letter to thank him. David Richardson had been a school teacher before the war. In another timeline, in a world where the war had not happened, he would have spent his life in a classroom in Portland, teaching history and literature to children who would grow up in peace. He would have had a different kind of life, predictable, ordinary, meaningful in small and local ways. But the war had come, and David had been drafted, and he had been sent to the Pacific Theater not as a combat soldier, but as part of the support infrastructure that sustained military operations. He had processed logistics. He had maintained supply chains. He had kept records and managed personnel rosters. He had been a soldier in the sense that he wore a uniform and took orders, but he had not been, in the traditional sense, a warrior. The psychological distance between logistics and combat was supposed to create moral distance as well. David was supposed to be removed from the consequences of his military service, supposed to be able to engage with the war as an abstract system rather than as a collection of human suffering. But the closer he got to the end of the war in the Pacific, the more that abstraction had begun to crack apart. By August 1945, stationed in Osaka in the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, David could no longer maintain the fiction of distance. He was surrounded by the physical manifestation of industrial-scale destruction. Buildings were reduced to ash. Civilians wandered through the wreckage in a state of profound shock and devastation. The city itself seemed to have been transformed into a landscape of hell. Gray, smoking, devoid of the infrastructure that makes human life possible. Occupation protocol was explicit. Japanese civilians were to be treated as potential security threats. Fraternization was prohibited. Assistance beyond the bare minimum required by military occupation law was considered unnecessary. The officer commanding David's unit had made clear, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that their job was to establish order and control, not to provide humanitarian assistance. David had been assigned to search buildings in a neighborhood that had been partially destroyed by conventional bombing in the weeks before the atomic weapons were deployed. Most of the structures were beyond salvage, wooden buildings reduced to charcoal and ash. Any intact interior spaces collapsed or unstable. It was tedious work, dangerous work, and fundamentally pointless work. No Japanese military personnel were hiding in these ruins. No weapons caches were being stored in destroyed homes. But the orders had come down, and David followed them. He was searching a partially collapsed structure when he heard the sound of movement from the basement. His training kicked in immediately. Caution, suspicion, the assumption that anything unexpected was potentially dangerous. He descended into the darkness carefully, his hand on his sidearm, prepared for some kind of resistance. What he found instead was a family. The woman, later he would learn her name was Yuki, was perhaps 30 years old, though the devastation and trauma had aged her face. She was positioned protectively over 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 years and a girl of perhaps 6. All 3 were frightened, their eyes wide with terror at the sound of a foreign soldier descending into their refuge. Yuki's first instinct was to position herself between the soldier and her children, her body language making clear that she would resist any attempt to harm them. But David, understanding the terror in her eyes, understanding the calculation happening in her mind, whether this soldier would become another source of violence or might somehow represent something different, David made a choice that he would spend the rest of his life processing. He lowered his hand from his sidearm. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands to show they were empty and unthreatening. He looked at the children, directly at them, as if acknowledging their humanity, as if refusing to see them as security threats. And he smiled. Not a soldier's smile, not the smile of a conqueror, but the smile of a human being attempting to communicate that no harm was intended. Yuki's body had remained tense, but her eyes had changed. The absolute terror had transformed into something more like cautious assessment. She was studying David, trying to determine whether his apparent non-hostility was genuine or tactical. David had taken a very deliberate step backward, back toward the basement stairs. He had not gone far. He had remained close enough that she could see him, close enough that his non-threat was undeniable, but far enough that he was not imposing his presence into their space. And then he had spoken, not in Japanese, which he did not speak, but in simple English, his voice gentle, his tone communicating what words could not in a language she did not understand. "It's okay. You're safe. I'm going to leave now. But I'm going to come back. I'm going to help." Whether she understood the specific words was less important than understanding the intent. David had backed up the stairs, had emerged into the daylight, and had sealed the basement entrance in a way that appeared secure from the outside, but that would not trap the family inside, that would allow them to escape if necessary. He had then done something that violated every protocol, every order, every instruction he had been given about occupation duties. He had gone to his unit's supply depot and had removed food, canned rations primarily, but also whatever fresh food was available. He had wrapped it carefully and had returned to the building under the pretense of conducting a more thorough search. He had left the food outside the basement entrance where the family could find it. He had written a simple message on a piece of paper, just a drawing of a hand with fingers extended, the universal gesture of peace, and had placed it beside the food. When he had returned to his unit and reported on the search, he had lied. He had said the building contained no survivors, no weapons, nothing of significance. He had filed a false report. He had deliberately deceived his commanding officer in order to protect a family of Japanese civilians from the systematic violence of the occupation. And he had known in the moment of making that choice that it was a choice that would define him, that it would separate him from the soldiers around him who participated without question in the occupation's violence, that it would make him in some fundamental way a different kind of soldier than the ones trained to see enemies rather than human beings. But he had also understood that the alternative, following orders, treating a terrified woman and her children as security threats participating in the systematic violence of the occupation, that alternative would have made him something unrecognizable to himself. So he had chosen, and having chosen once, he would choose again and again over the following weeks in small acts of kindness that accumulated into a kind of quiet resistance to the occupation system itself. August, September 1945. Osaka, the occupation period. A soldier and a family learning to trust each other across the boundaries of war. Over the following weeks, David developed a relationship with Yuki and her children that existed entirely outside official protocols, entirely hidden from the military hierarchy, entirely predicated on his willingness to lie and deceive in order to protect them from the occupation's systematic violence. He learned Yuki's story through gestures and simple words, through the translation efforts of a Japanese-American soldier in a different unit who agreed, without explanation, to help facilitate communication. Yuki's husband, Kenji, had been a teacher, a man not unlike David himself. He had been conscripted into the army in the final year of the war, when Japan's desperation had forced them to deploy even men with no military training. He had died in the defense of Osaka, just days before the atomic bombing of Nagasaki had forced Japan to surrender. Yuki had been left alone with her children in a city that had been systematically destroyed by American bombing. Their home had been reduced to ash. Most of their neighbors had been killed. The infrastructure of civilian life, shops, clinics, schools, the basic systems that make survival possible, had been obliterated. Yuki had managed to find shelter in the basement of a partially collapsed building and was attempting to keep her children alive on the meager resources available in a devastated city. David began bringing food regularly. He brought American military rations, which seemed like abundance to people who were experiencing systematic starvation. He brought chocolate and he watched Hiroshi, the boy, carefully portion it out, eating small pieces as if to make it last as long as possible, as if trying to extend the joy of having something sweet in a world of deprivation. He brought medicine when he could obtain it. He brought cloth and materials that might be useful for creating clothing and shelter. He brought, most importantly, safety, the guarantee of his own nonviolence, the reliability of his repeated return, the commitment to protecting them that his actions communicated more clearly than any words could have. Yuki watched this process unfold with careful assessment. She was, David understood through their halting communication, attempting to determine whether his kindness was genuine or whether it was some kind of tactical maneuver that would eventually betray her and her children. The concept of an American soldier offering unconditional assistance ran so counter to everything she had experienced during the bombing and the occupation that it was understandable that she approached it with deep skepticism. But gradually, over the course of weeks, trust developed. Not complete trust. That would have been unrealistic, given the systematic violence of the occupation and the trauma both they and David had experienced. But functional trust. The understanding that in this specific relationship, between this American soldier and this Japanese woman and her children, a different kind of interaction was possible. One evening, David brought gifts, proper gifts, not just rations. A doll for Akiko, a handmade toy for Hiroshi, a scarf for Yuki. She had wept when she received them. Not tears of joy, but tears of profound grief and confusion. The incomprehensible reality of receiving kindness in a world that had been structured entirely around violence and deprivation. It was during one of these evening visits, as David was sitting in the basement with the family, sharing tea that Yuki had somehow managed to prepare, that a photographer, a military documenter assigned to record occupation activities, had appeared. The man had been taking photographs of various aspects of the occupation when he had apparently seen David enter the building and had followed him down into the basement. The photographer had taken several photographs of the scene. David sitting with the family, the children beside him, Yuki holding Hiroshi's hand, the evident comfort and lack of fear in the children's expressions. And then before the photographer had left, he had asked if he could take one more photograph, a formal portrait with David standing beside the family. It was this photograph that had been preserved and carried through 70 years of history. The photographer had apparently understood the significance of what he was documenting. This was not a typical occupation photograph. This was evidence of something that contradicted the systematic narrative of the occupation. Evidence that an American soldier could choose kindness, could treat Japanese civilians as human beings, could refuse to participate in the occupation's violence. The photographer had told David what he was doing. He had explained that he was preserving evidence of humanity during wartime, of moments when individual soldiers chose compassion over protocol. He had said that he didn't know when or if this photograph would ever be revealed, but that he understood it needed to exist. Someday, the photographer had told David, someone will need to see this. Someone will need to understand that during the darkest moments of history, there were Americans who chose to be different. Keep living the way you're living. Keep helping this family. And trust that your choice to refuse participation in violence will matter. The investigation into what happened to Yuki and her children took me across multiple continents and several years of research, drawing on resources from university archives, international genealogy databases, and the personal connections that accumulated as historians learned about the project. and voluntarily contributed their own expertise and research capabilities. Michael Richardson's letter, the one that David had apparently received in 1987, had been written by Yuki, now in her 80s, reflecting on her life in the decades following the occupation. According to the letter, which a Japanese colleague translated for me, Yuki had survived the post-war period. She and her children had rebuilt a life in Osaka. Hiroshi had become a teacher, following in the footsteps of both his father and the American soldier who had saved his life. Akiko had become a nurse, apparently dedicated to healing work that mirrored the assistance she had received during the occupation. Yuki had lived until 1985, long enough to see her children grow to adulthood, long enough to see her grandchildren born and raised in a Japan that had recovered from the devastation of the war. She had apparently spent her later years attempting to locate David Richardson, apparently feeling a profound debt to the man who had risked his military career and personal safety to assist her family. The letter, translated from Japanese to English, read in part, "I do not know if this letter will reach you. The United States is far away, and I am an old woman with limited resources, but I must try. I must try to tell you that your kindness saved not only my life and the lives of my children. Your kindness saved my hope. After the atomic bombing, after my husband's death, after the systematic destruction of everything I knew, I had lost hope that the world contained human beings capable of compassion. You reminded me that compassion was possible, that an American soldier could choose to be human rather than simply to be a soldier. That choice, more than any military victory or occupation protocol, allowed me to rebuild my life. My children are alive because you chose kindness. My grandchildren exist because you chose kindness. When I close my eyes for the final time, I will remember the taste of American chocolate shared in a basement, and I will remember that in the darkest moment of history, there was at least one person who chose to see me as a human being rather than as an enemy." The letter had apparently reached David in Portland, forwarded multiple times through military and postal services. He had apparently kept it, had apparently read it repeatedly, apparently allowed it to provide him with the one piece of evidence he had apparently sought for decades: confirmation that his choice to help had mattered, that Yuki and her children had survived, that the seeds of compassion he had planted in an occupation basement had borne fruit in the form of generations of human beings living in peace. When I traced Hiroshi's life through Japanese educational and professional records, I discovered that he had indeed become a teacher, a career that seemed to honor both the father he had lost to war and the American soldier who had saved his life. He had spent 40 years working in Japanese schools, apparently dedicating himself to education and the development of the next generation. He had apparently never spoken publicly about the occupation or about David Richardson, but his granddaughter, Yuki's great-granddaughter, eventually became curious about her great-grandmother's mysterious connection to an American soldier. That curiosity led her to make contact with Michael Richardson in the early 2000s, after David had died. Through a series of emails and international phone calls, the two families discovered each other across the Pacific, connected by a single photograph taken in August 1945. The great-granddaughter, now living in Tokyo, explained that her grandfather had carried stories of the American soldier who had helped his family during the occupation, though he had never identified him by name. The stories had been passed down through the family as a kind of sacred history, a moment when kindness had persisted despite systematic violence. Michael Richardson had shared the photograph and David's journals with Hiroshi's family. They had wept. They had understood for the first time the full scope of what David had risked in order to help them. And they had apparently decided that the story needed to be shared more broadly, that history needed to know that Americans during the occupation were capable of compassion, that individual choices mattered, that the war did not end human capacity for kindness. When I published the full story in a major historical journal, it generated significant attention. Historians of the Pacific War began reassessing the occupation period with more nuance, recognizing that it was not monolithic, that individual soldiers made individual choices that mattered. Veterans began coming forward with their own stories of choosing compassion during the occupation. Military historians began incorporating the narrative of moral agency into discussions of American military conduct. But what struck me most powerfully was the response from contemporary soldiers and officers. They began reading about David Richardson's choice to lie, to deceive, to violate orders in order to protect a family, and they began asking themselves questions about their own capacity for moral agency, their own ability to refuse orders that they believed violated their conscience. Michael Richardson participated in interviews and documentaries about his father's experience. He spoke about the man David Richardson had been, not a military hero in the conventional sense, but a human being who had understood that maintaining his own humanity was more important than maintaining his military career. He spoke about how his father had lived with the weight of that choice, had carried the photograph and the knowledge of the family's survival as a kind of sacred testimony to the possibility of kindness in the darkest moments. And Hiroshi's family in Tokyo continued the legacy in their own way. They created a small museum dedicated to preserving memory of the occupation period and the relationships, however complicated, that had formed between American soldiers and Japanese civilians during that time. The photograph of David Richardson with Yuki and her children was displayed prominently, accompanied by the journals and the letters, telling the story of one American's choice to remain human during a period of systematic dehumanization. Some photographs capture more than faces. They hold the moment when an individual human being chooses to resist a system of violence through the simple act of extending kindness. This image, taken in August 1945 in a devastated Osaka neighborhood, preserves within its frame a testament to the possibility of compassion operating in the spaces where systems demand cruelty. I have spent years now studying David Richardson, not as a soldier, not as a military functionary, but as a human being confronted with choices that would define the rest of his life. He could have followed orders. He could have treated a terrified woman and her children as security threats. He could have participated in the occupation's systematic violence and returned home to live a quiet life without confronting what he had participated in. Instead, he chose to lie. He chose to deceive his commanding officer. He chose to risk his military career and his personal safety in order to protect a family. And most importantly, he chose to preserve evidence of his refusal through a single photograph that would not be seen for 70 years, waiting for the moment when history might finally be ready to honor that choice. When I look at the photograph now, at the boy's hand gripping his mother's hand, at the evident comfort and safety in the children's expressions, at the quiet tenderness visible in David Richardson's face, I am confronted with a different kind of war story than the ones we typically tell. This is not a story of military victory or strategic triumph. This is a story of individual conscience persisting despite institutional pressure to abandon it. David lived until 1998, spending 53 years after the occupation living as a schoolteacher in Portland, Oregon. He married a woman named Eleanor. He raised 3 children. He taught thousands of students about history and literature. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life by the standards of conventional achievement. But everything he did was shaped by that moment in August 1945, when he made the choice to see a Japanese family as human beings rather than as enemies. The students he taught benefited from a teacher who understood, in his bones, that individual choices matter, that compassion is possible even in circumstances where systems demand cruelty, that remaining human is more important than remaining compliant. Yuki lived until 1985. She had written the letter to David not out of a desire for recognition or gratitude, though both were present, but out of a need to communicate to him that his choice had mattered, that in the devastation and trauma of the occupation, one act of kindness had made the difference between despair and hope, between the complete erosion of faith in human goodness and the preservation of that faith. The boy, Hiroshi, grew to adulthood and became a teacher himself. Whether consciously or unconsciously, he had apparently chosen to honor both his biological father, who had died defending his country, and his spiritual father, the American soldier who had saved his life. He had dedicated his life to education, to the development of young minds, to the transmission of knowledge and values to future generations. Every student he taught was a descendant, in some sense, of David Richardson's choice to extend kindness. What strikes me most profoundly when I encounter this photograph now is the simplicity of what it documents. It is not a grand gesture. It is not a moment of heroic resistance in the conventional sense. It is simply an American soldier choosing to sit with a Japanese family, choosing to treat them with dignity, choosing to preserve evidence of that choice through a single photograph. But in that simplicity, In that quiet refusal to participate in the occupation's systematic violence, something sacred persists. Something that transcends nationality and war and the categories we use to divide ourselves from one another. Something that suggests the possibility of human connection operating in the spaces where systems demand dehumanization. The boy in the photograph is holding his mother's hand. An American soldier sits beside them, clearly, unambiguously, choosing to see them as human beings. And somewhere for 70 years, David carried this photograph as testimony to that choice, waiting for the moment when it could safely be revealed, waiting for history to be ready to hear the story. That moment has come. The photograph is now visible. The story is now told. And in its telling, we are confronted with questions about our own capacity for moral agency, our own ability to refuse systems that demand we abandon our humanity. What would I have done in David Richardson's position? What would any of us do when confronted with the opportunity to choose compassion or compliance? The photograph asks this question silently, persistently, demanding that we examine ourselves in its frame. The boy's hand grips his mother's hand. The evidence of safety, of trust, of the human capacity for kindness persisting in the darkest moments. This evidence now belongs to history. It belongs to all of us who encounter it, who are asked to consider what it means, who are challenged to ask ourselves, in this moment, in this system, in these circumstances, what will I choose? David Richardson chose kindness. He chose to lie for the sake of compassion. He chose to preserve evidence that such choices were possible. And in making that choice, he created a photograph that would speak across 70 years, speaking to all of us about the fundamental truth that individual human beings retain the capacity to choose differently, to refuse systems, to extend compassion in moments when compassion seems impossible. Some photographs capture more than faces. They capture the moment when a human being asserts their humanity against systems designed to eliminate it. They preserve, for history to eventually discover, the possibility that even in the darkest moments of organized violence and systematic dehumanization, kindness endures, that compassion is possible, that love, expressed through the simple act of treating another person with dignity, remains the most powerful force available to human beings confronted with the demand to participate in cruelty. The photograph endures. David is gone. Yuki is gone. But their choice to see each other as human beings, their choice to extend compassion across the boundaries of war and occupation, this choice persists in the frame, asking each of us to consider what we would do, asking us to examine ourselves against the standard they set. The boy's hand holding his mother's hand. This is the testimony. This is the evidence that one American soldier chose to be human. This is the memorial to what is possible when individual conscience triumphs over institutional violence.